Alright guys, so I'll do these screencasts from time to time, especially when the class is in different parts of an assignment. So some of you are still working on part 1 of your hyperdocs, some of you are working on other boxes. Either way, I want you guys to have this screencast to use on your assignment and to study for your test. Now, if you take a look at the map I put up here, all those different lines depict different times in U.S. history where we tried to push west. So starting with the blue line, you got Lewis and Clark, and then that red line, you got the Transcontinental Railroad, which we're studying now. So I put this up here so you understand how long the United States has been pushing west, how important it has been to our development, and how many groups of people that we've impacted along the way. Now, we are going to look specifically at groups of people who made the trip west. We're going to start with the African Americans, known as the Exodusters. So, as we talked about, the South was still feeling the remnants of pre-Civil War slavery. Now, you may have heard of Jim Crow laws before. We'll talk about the Jim Crow South again when we get to the Civil Rights Movement towards the end of the year. But the African Americans were still being discriminated against in the South. Many of them were still sharecroppers, and many of them still had zero rights. So they saw moving west as an opportunity to get away from sharecropping, to get away from slavery, to get away from the oppression they faced in the South. So they moved west. Again, they were called the Exodusters, and their leader, his name was Pap Singleton. Now, when I do these screencasts, I always try to sprinkle some extra credit questions or test questions in here. Well, Pap Singleton, I will make an extra credit question. Remember, Pap Singleton was the man who led the African American Exodusters west, and they settled in Kansas. Now, the Kansas part is going to be a test question. Again, I want to see who's paying attention. People always ask, how in the world did they get the name the Exodusters? Well, it's based off of the Bible. So the Exodusters were named after a book in the Bible called the Exodus. Now, if you aren't familiar with the Bible, which is no big deal, I will explain it here in a second, especially that underlined part. So Jews in this book were described as a group of people who were trying to leave slavery in Egypt. Well, just like the Jews tried to escape slavery in Egypt, the African Americans are trying to escape slavery and oppression in the South. So that's why they got called the Exodusters. So again, African Americans, referred to as the Exodusters, mostly settled in Kansas and led by Benjamin Pap Singleton. Now, next group we're going to look at, we talked about these people briefly. These are your homesteaders. These are the people who took advantage of the Homestead Act. So, again, you'll see the soddy here. You'll see the steel plow, which was an invention during Westward Expansion. Here's a family. Again, this was a big-time family move. But a lot of these people who took advantage of the Homestead Act struggled to farm. So as we talked about how a lot of the people who moved west really relied on the environment, the agriculture, things of that nature, and they struggled to do so because they weren't farmers by trade. That's the problem. Back east, many of these people weren't farmers. So as they moved west, dealing with a new climate, new ground, new geography, they didn't know how to farm in those types of situations. So they struggled. The environment really made it difficult for them to farm, and this is why the Morrill Land-Grant Act was so important. The Morrill Land-Grant Act, if you remember, gave money to agricultural colleges, meaning colleges that would focus on farming techniques, improving agriculture, got money and land out of this Morrill Land-Grant Act. Remember, we talked about NC State being one of those schools. And they also had to deal with the bugs, grasshoppers, cicadas. They would literally destroy entire crops. Now, farmers also obviously had to use the railroad. Well, the railroad was extremely corrupt during this time, and the railroad owners could charge whatever they want to whoever they want and however they want. So the Grange, that's that bold word up at the top, the Grange was formed as kind of a labor union to support and protect these farmers, to protect them from prices being too high, from being taken advantage of. So the Grange was created to protect and regulate, protect the farmers and regulate the railroad industry. This led to the Interstate Commerce Act. It was a federal law that regulated commerce. Now, the crazy thing is, the Grangers, or the Grange, eventually became the Democratic Party. So, before it officially became the Democratic Party, you have the Populist Party. And again, down here it says eventually the Democratic Party adopted this platform and the Populist Party went away. So if you see the Populist Party, you could call it the People's Party. They're synonymous. But it was largely supported in the Midwest. They had what they called the Omaha platform, and you can see some of the things they wanted to do there. And they won many elections in 1892, especially in the Midwest. Because remember, that's where a lot of people are settling. And again, the Democrats eventually absorbed this party and adopted many of their ideas. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk about is how American movies, Hollywood, West movies, always portray cowboys, ranchers, and vaqueros as white men. Well, that's not always true. In fact, a lot of ranchers had Hispanic heritage, especially in the Southwest, and many were African American. So when you watch those old Western movies, just know they're not 100% accurate because there were African Americans and Hispanic cowboys. In fact, they were actually more popular, more prevalent than the actual white movie stars that you saw portrayed in the movies. Now, the Mormons. So I heard some of you talking about this yesterday, but this is the religious group. If you think back to the three G's, this is your God. So they moved west to escape religious persecution. They practiced, and they do not practice this anymore, but they practiced polygamy back in the east. That became extremely popular. Again, polygamy is illegal. They do not practice that today, so don't go around saying, oh, Mormons all practice polygamy. No, that is an older belief. But they settled in Salt Lake City, Utah, and they were taken there by their leader, Brigham Young. If you're a sports fan, chances are you know what BYU is, or you at least heard of it. Well, that's Brigham Young University. It was founded because of their trip westward. Now, they still faced persecution in the West, but it was not as severe or profound as back in the East. So again, the Mormons went west. Remember the three G's. They went for God. Now, we talked about these folks briefly yesterday. The two groups that we'll talk about kind of in detail in this class are the Irish and the Chinese. Remember, the Irish and the Chinese did all the dangerous, scary, long jobs out on the Transcontinental Railroad. I can't stress this enough. If it was not for the immigrants, if immigrants were not working on the Transcontinental Railroad, it would not have gotten finished. But remember, this led to some resentment between their white counterparts. This is known as nativism. It eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Again, I'm not going to read this entire thing to you. This is a vocab term that is on your vocab list. If I were you, I'd hit pause here and just read over this really quick because, again, I'm not going to read two paragraphs to you. You are all intelligent people and quite capable of reading it on your own. So take a look at this. It's okay to hit the pause button and make sure you have this down on your HyperDoc because you're going to need to know it. Now, again, something we talked about. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but because the white settlers and the Transcontinental Railroad and the homesteaders were invading and taking over Native American land, this led to several bloody conflicts, and the United States government started to push these Native Americans onto reservations again. This is what we talked about. So the buffalo, remember that picture I showed you in your notes yesterday about how the Native Americans used the buffalo for everything, while the white settlers barely used it all, more for fur and more for economic purposes. Now, there's one thing on here called the Fort Laramie Treaty. This is a treaty made with the Cheyenne tribe where the Americans said an area of land belonged to the Cheyenne forever, but we found gold there. And then we forced them to sign a new treaty, and then we broke, really, most treaties that we signed with them. So it made it very, very difficult for the Native Americans to trust us, and it made it very difficult for the settlers and the Native Americans to live side by side. So again, just keep that in mind. We tried. And when I say try, I mean we made some type of effort to live peacefully with them as long as it only benefited us. So again, do not look at this relationship as a good one. This was 100% the United States government, the settlers taking advantage of these Native American people. Again, we talked about the Dawes Act, so there's another definition for you, so you got that. And the Native Americans prayed for a new world without the white people in the ghost dance religion. So, this ghost dance, crazy thing. They would, in the middle of the night, they would dance around a fire in their traditional clothing. And basically, the ghost dance was used to bring back the buffalo. It was a very spiritual thing. He used to bring back the buffalo, call upon their ancestors, and to push the settlers off of their land. So the ghost dance, again, was a very religious dance. It was a tribal dance, and the hope was that their ancestors would bring back the buffalo and push the white settlers off of their land. So that is where I'll end this. Again, some big takeaways for you, just to wrap this whole thing up. Be able to tie these groups into your 3Gs. Be able to tell me the significance of the Grange, how that turned into the Populist Party, and then how that turned into the Democratic Party. Keep those things in mind. Also, don't forget that you need to be aware of why people went west. Always remember that. When you talk about people, remember why we went west and how that impacted the Native Americans. So again, take a look at your hyperdoc and see where you can fill in some of the blanks with the information that you got here.